The morning mist clung to the Arizona desert like a shroud, and Margaret Sullivan pulled her wool cardigan tighter as she stepped onto the weathered porch of her isolated cabin. At 63, her once auburn hair had faded to silver, and the lines around her eyes spoke of both laughter and tears, though lately there had been precious little of the former. 3 years had passed since her husband Thomas died in that terrible accident at the copper mine. 3 years of silence, so profound it seemed to echo off the canyon walls that surrounded her small homestead, 30 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Ridge. The October air bit at her cheeks as she made her way to the mailbox, a weekly ritual that rarely yielded anything more than bills and advertisements. But today something was different. As she rounded the bend where the dirt road met the main highway, her breath caught in her throat. There, huddled against a weathered fence post, was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. His dark hair fell in tangled waves across his face, and his clothes, torn jeans and a thin t-shirt, were wholly inadequate for the desert's cold morning air. He was Apache, she could tell immediately from his features, though what an Apache child was doing alone on this desolate stretch of road was beyond her comprehension. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret whispered, quickening her pace, despite the arthritis in her knees. The boy's eyes, dark as obsidian and filled with a wariness that no child should possess, tracked her movement as she approached. He didn't run, but every muscle in his small body seemed coiled like a spring. "Hey there, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, crouching down a few feet away from him. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The boy said nothing, just stared at her with those haunting eyes. His lips were chapped, and she could see the slight tremor in his hands, whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. "Are you hurt?" She tried again, her voice gentle as warm honey. "I'm Margaret. I live just up that road there." She pointed toward her cabin, barely visible through the mesquite and palo verde trees. Still silence. Margaret's heart ached looking at this child, so small and alone in the vastness of the desert. Without thinking, she shrugged off her cardigan and held it out to him. "You must be freezing, honey." For a moment, the boy just stared at the offered garment. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it, wrapping it around his thin shoulders. The cardigan dwarfed him, but Margaret could see some of the tension leave his body as the warmth enveloped him. "There, that's better," she said with a smile. "Now, when was the last time you had something to eat?" The boy's stomach answered for him with a loud growl that made his cheeks flush with embarrassment. Margaret chuckled softly. "I'll take that as a while ago. How about we get you some breakfast? I make a mean stack of pancakes, and I've got maple syrup, the real stuff, not that corn syrup nonsense." She stood slowly, her knees protesting, and extended her hand. "What do you say? Will you come with me?" The boy looked at her hand for a long moment, then at her face, as if trying to read something there. Finally, he reached out and placed his small, cold fingers in her palm. "That's my boy," Margaret said, squeezing gently. "Let's get you warmed up." As they walked back toward the cabin together, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this unexpected encounter on a cold October morning, was going to change everything. She had no idea how right she was. The cabin's warmth enveloped them like an embrace as Margaret led the boy inside. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the cozy interior, the stone fireplace with its crackling fire, the handmade quilts draped over the sofa, the photographs of Margaret and Thomas scattered on the mantelpiece. "Go ahead and sit anywhere you like," Margaret said, heading toward the kitchen. "I'll get those pancakes started." The boy moved cautiously to the stone hearth, settling cross-legged on the braided rug in front of the fire. Margaret's cardigan still wrapped around him like a protective cocoon. She watched him from the kitchen as she mixed the batter, noting how his eyes darted around the room, not with the curiosity of a typical child, but with the hyper-vigilance of someone who'd learned that safety was never guaranteed. "So," Margaret said, trying to keep her tone light as she poured batter onto the griddle, "I'm guessing you didn't just decide to take a morning stroll on Highway 191? Someone drop you off out there?" The boy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent. Margaret nodded as if he'd answered. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make much sense to the rest of us. She flipped a pancake with practiced ease. "My husband Thomas used to say that some people are so lost in their own troubles they can't see past the end of their nose to notice who they might be hurting." She could see the boy's reflection in the kitchen window. He was watching her, listening to every word even as he pretended to stare into the flames. "These are just about ready," Margaret announced, stacking the golden pancakes on a plate. She added a pat of butter that began melting immediately and drizzled real maple syrup over the top. "I hope you're hungry." She set the plate on the coffee table near where the boy sat, along with a fork and a glass of cold milk. "Go on," she encouraged. "Don't let them get cold." The boy's hunger won out over his wariness. He ate with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd learned not to take meals for granted, but Margaret noticed he still kept glancing at her, as if expecting the kindness to evaporate at any moment. "Good?" she asked, settling into Thomas's old recliner with her own cup of coffee. The boy nodded, his first real response since she'd found him. "I'm glad," Margaret said. "There's plenty more where that came from. This old place gets pretty quiet, so it's nice to have someone to cook for again." The boy paused mid-bite, studying her face with those sharp, dark eyes. "You know," Margaret continued, "I never did catch your name. I'm Margaret Sullivan, but my friends call me Maggie. What should I call you?" For a moment she thought he might actually answer. His lips parted slightly, but then he closed them again and returned to his pancakes. "That's all right," Margaret said gently. "Names are powerful things. Some folks believe you shouldn't give yours away too quickly. Take your time." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the boy's quiet eating. When he'd finished every last bite, Margaret noticed him trying to stifle a yawn. "You look exhausted, sweetheart," she observed. "When was the last time you had a proper night's sleep?" The boy's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the question had reminded his body just how tired it was. "I've got a spare room," Margaret said carefully. It was supposed to be for grandchildren that never came along, but it's got a comfortable bed and clean sheets. You're welcome to rest for a while." The boy looked toward the hallway she'd indicated, then back at her, uncertainty written across his features. "I'll be right here," Margaret assured him. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you, not until you're ready." Something in her tone, perhaps the absolute certainty of it, seemed to convince him. He stood slowly, still wrapped in her cardigan, and followed her down the hallway. The spare room was painted a soft blue, with white curtains that filtered the afternoon sunlight into gentle patterns on the hardwood floor. A twin bed sat against one wall, covered with one of Margaret's hand-stitched quilts. "The bathroom's right across the hall," Margaret said. "There are clean towels if you want to wash up, and I'll see if I can find you some clothes that fit better than what you're wearing." The boy sat on the edge of the bed, testing its softness. "Rest as long as you need to," Margaret said from the doorway. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything." She was halfway down the hall when she heard it, so soft she almost missed it. "Danny." Margaret turned back, but the boy had already curled up on the bed, her cardigan pulled tight around him. She smiled to herself as she continued to the kitchen. Danny. It was a start. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret found Danny by the roadside, and their daily routine had settled into something that felt surprisingly natural. Danny still didn't speak much, but his silences had grown comfortable rather than wary. He helped with small chores around the cabin, gathering kindling, feeding the chickens, tending to Margaret's small vegetable garden, and she had come to treasure their quiet companionship. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Margaret prepared breakfast, humming an old tune Thomas used to sing. Danny sat at the small dining table, carefully working on a homework packet that Margaret had picked up from the Cedar Ridge Elementary School. She hadn't officially enrolled him yet. That would require paperwork and questions she wasn't ready to answer, but she was determined he wouldn't fall behind in his education. "How's that math coming along?" Margaret asked, glancing over his shoulder at the worksheet. Danny pointed to a word problem about calculating distances, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Ah, that's a tricky one," Margaret said, settling into the chair beside him. "Let's see. If a car travels 60 miles in 1 hour, how far will it travel in 3 hours? Danny chewed on the end of his pencil, then wrote 180 in careful numerals. "That's exactly right," Margaret beamed. "You're getting good at these." A small smile tugged at the corner of Danny's mouth, an expression she'd been seeing more often lately, and one that never failed to warm her heart. The peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching on the gravel road. Margaret's stomach tightened as she recognized the rumble of Sheriff Coleman's patrol car. She and Danny exchanged glances. His eyes had gone wide with something that looked dangerously close to panic. "It's all right," Margaret said quickly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Sheriff Coleman's an old friend. He probably just stopped by to check on me." But even as she said it, Margaret felt her own anxiety rising. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing it would come eventually. Sheriff Jim Coleman was a bear of a man, in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Thomas's friend since childhood, and he'd checked on Margaret regularly since she'd become a widow. Today, though, his expression was more serious than usual as she opened the door. "Morning, Maggie," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." Margaret's heart sank, but she stepped aside to let him enter. Danny had disappeared from the dining table, probably hiding in his room, she realized. "Coffee?" Margaret offered, trying to keep her voice steady. "That'd be good, thanks," Jim said, settling his large frame into one of the kitchen chairs. He looked around the cabin with observant eyes. "Place looks good, Maggie. You keeping up all right out here?" "I manage," Margaret replied, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "What brings you by, Jim?" The sheriff accepted his cup and took a sip before answering. "Had a call from Child Protective Services yesterday. They're looking for a missing boy, Apache kid, about 8 or 9 years old. Name's Daniel Begay." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down her own cup. "That's so. His grandmother filed a missing person report 3 weeks ago," Jim continued, watching Margaret's face carefully. "Boy was staying with some relatives in Phoenix while she was in the hospital, but apparently those relatives decided they couldn't handle him anymore, dropped him off somewhere, and never looked back." Margaret felt a surge of anger so fierce it surprised her. "They just abandoned him." "Seems that way," Jim said sadly. "His grandmother's been frantic. She's out of the hospital now, living on the San Carlos reservation about 2 hours south of here. She's been calling every law enforcement agency in Arizona looking for her grandson." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. "Maggie," Jim said gently, "you wouldn't happen to know anything about this boy, would you?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "If I did know something about a child in that situation, what would happen to him?" "Well," Jim said carefully, "officially, he'd be returned to his grandmother's custody. She's his legal guardian, and by all accounts, she loves that boy something fierce. And unofficially," Jim leaned back in his chair, cleaned. Unofficially, I'd say that if someone had been taking care of a lost child for the past couple weeks, making sure he was fed and safe, and maybe even getting some schooling, well, that someone would have my gratitude. And I might be inclined to think that person deserved to be part of whatever happens next. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. The thought of losing Danny was almost unbearable, but the thought of him having a grandmother who loved him, who had been searching desperately for him, made her chest ache with a different kind of pain. His grandmother, Margaret said quietly. What's she like? Rosa Begay. She's good people, Maggie. Raised 5 kids of her own. Took in Daniel when his parents died in a car crash 2 years ago. She's getting on in years, probably about your age. But she's tough as nails. Works as a teacher's aide on the reservation. From the hallway came a soft sound, a floorboard creaking. Margaret knew Danny was listening to every word. She's been sick? Margaret asked. Diabetes complications, Jim explained. Had to have surgery, spent 6 weeks in the hospital. That's why Daniel was staying with the relatives in Phoenix. Soon as she was well enough, she started calling around looking for him. Margaret closed her eyes, imagining the terror that poor woman must have felt, recovering from surgery only to discover her beloved grandson had vanished. Jim, Margaret said finally, there's something I need to tell you. Before she could continue, Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd changed into one of the shirts Margaret had bought him, a blue flannel that brought out his eyes, and his hair was combed neatly back. He looked directly at Sheriff Coleman. My name is Daniel Begay, he said clearly, his voice stronger than Margaret had ever heard it. I've been staying with Mrs. Sullivan. Jim's expression softened as he looked at the boy. Hello, Daniel. Your grandmother's been very worried about you. Danny's composure cracked slightly. Is she really looking for me? She sure is, son. She loves you very much. Danny looked at Margaret, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Mrs. Sullivan saved me. She gave me food and a bed and she taught me fractions. Margaret had to bite her lip to keep from crying. She reached out and pulled Danny close to her side. What happens now? She asked Jim. The sheriff stood up, setting his empty coffee cup on the counter. Now, I make a phone call to a very relieved grandmother. But I think we can arrange for her to come here, rather than me taking Daniel away immediately. Give you all a chance to talk. Margaret felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Maggie, he replied. Not many people would have done what you did. As the sheriff's car disappeared down the gravel road, Margaret and Danny stood on the porch together, watching the dust settle. Are you scared? Margaret asked gently. Danny nodded. A little. What if she doesn't want me anymore? Margaret turned to face him, placing her hands on his shoulders. Danny, that woman has been searching for you for 3 weeks. She called every sheriff's office, every police station, every hospital in the state. That's not something you do for someone you don't want. But what about you? Danny asked, his voice small. I don't want to leave you alone again. Margaret's heart broke and mended itself in the same moment. She pulled Danny into a fierce hug, breathing in the scent of his hair, sunshine and soap and something indefinably precious. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You reminded me what it feels like to take care of someone, to worry about someone, to love someone. That's not something I'm going to lose just because you're not living under my roof. Promise? Danny asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. I promise, Margaret said firmly, and I think I'd like to meet this grandmother of yours. Anyone who raised a boy as special as you must be pretty remarkable herself. 3 days later, Margaret stood in her kitchen, nervously checking the apple pie in the oven for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Danny sat at the dining table, fidgeting with a pencil and glancing toward the window every few seconds. "They should be here soon," Margaret said, more to herself than to Danny. "What if she doesn't like me any more?" Danny asked, for what must have been the 20th time that morning. "Danny Begay," Margaret said firmly, turning to face him with her hands on her hips, "if you ask me that question one more time, I'm going to make you wash every dish in this house. Your grandmother loves you. Sheriff Coleman wouldn't have lied about that." A small smile broke through Danny's worried expression. Over the past few days, as they'd prepared for his grandmother's arrival, Margaret had seen more and more glimpses of the boy he truly was beneath the protective walls he'd built. Curious, gentle, with a quick wit and an even quicker smile. The sound of a car on the gravel road made them both freeze. Danny's eyes went wide, and Margaret felt her own heart start to race. "It's going to be fine," she said, as much to reassure herself as Danny. "Remember, she's probably just as nervous as you are." They watched from the window as Sheriff Coleman's patrol car pulled up, followed by an older Toyota sedan. The passenger door of the Toyota opened and a woman stepped out. Rosa Begay was smaller than Margaret had expected, probably no more than 5 feet tall, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple blue dress and a turquoise necklace, and even from a distance, Margaret could see the family resemblance between her and Danny. The same dark eyes, the same proud set to her shoulders. But what struck Margaret most was the way Rosa's face transformed the moment she saw Danny through the window. All the worry, all the fear, all the sleepless nights of searching, it all melted away, replaced by pure, radiant joy. "Grandmother," Danny whispered, and before Margaret could say anything, he was out the door and running across the yard. Rosa Begay caught her grandson in her arms, and they held each other with the desperate intensity of two people who had thought they might never see each other again. Margaret watched from the porch, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, as Rosa covered Danny's face with kisses and spoke to him in rapid Apache, her voice breaking with emotion. Sheriff Coleman approached the porch, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Hell of a thing," he said gruffly. "That woman hasn't slept more than a few hours at a time since he went missing." Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice just yet. After several minutes, Rosa and Danny approached the porch together, Rosa's arm firmly around her grandson's shoulders as if she might disappear if she let go. "Mrs. Sullivan," Rosa said, and her voice was warm and rich like honey. "I don't have words for what you've done. You saved my boy." "He saved me too," Margaret replied honestly. "Please come inside. I have coffee on, and there's pie." As they settled around Margaret's dining table, Rosa couldn't seem to stop touching Danny, smoothing his hair, holding his hand, as if reassuring herself that he was really there. Danny, for his part, seemed to be coming alive in a way Margaret had never seen before, chattering to his grandmother in a mixture of English and Apache about everything that had happened. "He looks good," Rosa said to Margaret as Danny went to wash his hands before dessert. "Healthy, happy even. He's a wonderful boy," Margaret said. "Smart as a whip and kind to his core. You did a beautiful job raising him." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "When I got out of the hospital and found out what my nephew and his wife had done, I wanted to kill them with my bare hands. To abandon a child like that." She shook her head. "But then I think, maybe the Creator knew what he was doing. Maybe Danny needed to find you as much as you needed to find him." Margaret looked at this woman, this stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger at all, and felt something shift in her chest. "Would you like to see his room? I mean, the room he's been staying in?" Rosa nodded, and they walked down the hallway together. The spare room still looked like Danny, his few possessions neatly arranged on the dresser, a stack of completed homework on the desk, one of Margaret's quilts folded at the foot of the bed. "This is beautiful," Rosa said, running her hand over the quilt. "You made this." "Years ago," Margaret said. "I always hoped," she trailed off. "That you'd have grandchildren of your own," Rosa finished gently. "Yes." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching through the window as Danny showed Sheriff Coleman how to feed the chickens. "Mrs. Sullivan," Rosa said carefully, "I live alone now since Danny's been gone. My house feels too quiet, too empty. And Danny, he talks about you like you hung the moon. Would you consider coming to visit us sometime? The reservation isn't far, maybe 2 hours. I could show you where Danny's parents are buried, introduce you to our family." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'd like that very much. And maybe," Rosa continued, "if you ever get lonely out here in this beautiful place, you could remember that you have family now, both of us." Later that afternoon, as Rosa and Danny prepared to leave, Margaret stood on her porch with a heart that was simultaneously breaking and healing. Danny's few belongings were packed in a grocery bag, and he clutched the teddy bear Margaret had given him, an old one of Thomas's from when he was a child. "I'll call you tonight," Danny promised, his arms wrapped tightly around Margaret's waist. "And Grandmother says you can come visit next weekend." "I'll be there," Margaret assured him. "And you can call me any time you want, okay? Day or night." Rosa approached, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you," she said, pressing it into Margaret's hands. "It's not much, but—" Margaret unwrapped the package to find a beautiful piece of Apache basketry, woven in intricate patterns with natural dyes. "It's gorgeous," Margaret breathed. "My mother made it," Rosa explained. "She always said that the best baskets are woven with love, and that they should go to people who understand what love means." As the Toyota's taillights disappeared down the gravel road, Margaret stood alone on her porch, holding the basket and watching the dust settle. But for the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt expectant, full of possibility. Her phone rang an hour later. "Mrs. Sullivan." Danny's voice was bright and happy. "I'm home, and Grandmother made fry bread for dinner, and I told her all about your chickens, and she says maybe we can get some chickens too, and can you really come visit this weekend?" Margaret laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls around her home. "Yes, sweetheart, I can really come visit this weekend." "Good," Danny said with satisfaction. "Because Grandmother wants to teach you how to make fry bread, and I want to show you my room here, and there's this place by the river where I used to catch tadpoles with my dad, and—" As Danny chattered on, Margaret settled into Thomas's old recliner with a cup of tea and Rosa's beautiful basket in her lap. Outside, the Arizona sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. For the first time in 3 long years, Margaret Sullivan was no longer alone, not in her heart, not in her home, and not in the quiet spaces where grief had once lived. The silence that had haunted her nights had finally been broken by laughter, by small footsteps, and by a voice that called her something she never thought she'd hear again: Mama. She hadn't found her family in the traditional sense, not by blood, not by marriage, not by anything that society would typically recognize. Instead, it came to her in the form of a lost, frightened Apache child standing at her doorstep, needing shelter, safety, and someone who could see beyond the fear in his eyes. Margaret hadn't been looking for anyone. In truth, she had stopped looking for much of anything, but when she opened her door that cold evening, she also, unknowingly, opened her heart. What began as an act of compassion became something far greater, a bond born not out of obligation, but of healing. In saving him from a world that had cast him aside, she had unknowingly saved herself, and as the days turned into months and the stranger became son, Margaret realized something profound, that family isn't always inherited. Sometimes it's chosen. Together, they had built something sacred, not perfect, but real, not easy, but worth every moment. Like the intricate patterns of an Apache basket, their lives became interwoven, thread by thread, with trust, with hope, with second chances, and with a love strong enough to endure the storms of life. And perhaps, just perhaps, those are the most beautiful families of all, the ones that find us when we need them the most.